I'm so excited to give this talk. I'm like looking at the people that are in the audience, and it makes me so happy to see a lot of my friends here. Um, so I kind of want to share something. Like as you know, as I was invited to do this, as the months have gone on and as people have presented, I feel like this talk has evolved a lot. At first, I was like, I'm going to tell everyone about all the cool stuff I'm doing with my research, about what my lab does, and so on. But then I started noticing that this is kind of like a really great opportunity to have like more honest conversations about representation in the sciences. And I kind of really want to use this, not just to talk about myself, but rather like how my life experiences has like changed the perspectives in giving advice to people, whether it's grad students, postdoctorates, or faculty, on how to help people that might have shared a background like mine or other minoritized students. So I kind of title it like, what does it take? Like an immigrant's path to neuroscience research. And spoilers, it takes a hell of a lot of mentorship and a lot of institutional effort to get people like me this far. So I kind of want to start off with where I'm from. I was born in Mexicali, Baja California, and like many immigrants, we moved around in search of opportunity or financial stability. And while in my childhood, we spent a lot of time moving around in Mexico, like Ciudad Obregón and Guadalajara, I think the biggest transition was obviously, as you might imagine, our movement to the United States. And the first place we ended up in was Escondido. And this is a really crappy time for our family because we didn't have like any family pictures from the time that we lived here. Like none of us really knew English. And I kind of remember just sitting in like my first year classroom and like looking at the standardized testing like Scantron and being like, I can't even read this. Like, what am I even supposed to do? And I couldn't even ask anyone for help because like no one around me spoke Spanish. Like I wasn't in English, remedial classes. I think my parents like soon noticed that me and my brother were like struggling hard. Like they eventually got the point that maybe we should move somewhere where like at least, like classes where people could learn English in a sort of more tolerating environment could help us in their education, because at the end of the day, that's really what they focused on. I'm really proud of my parents. They're extremely hardworking, taking on a variety of jobs such as field working, being a custodian, being a car salesman, and now to this day being retail workers for Walmart. And it really kind of highlights like the kind of privilege I had growing up. The fact that like I had both my parents, and they were able to provide for my brother and I financially so that we could focus on our studies. So we ended up in Calexico, which I guess we didn't end up moving much because it's right across the border from where I was born. And it kind of like set the stage for everything that happened thereafter in my life. I spent the rest of my childhood and teenage years in Calexico, which is kind of dwarfed in size by Mexicali, which is like a capital city, right? We have this like highly agricultural so-called city bordering this metropolis. And to highlight the sort of disparities between two cities, right? You had like a lot of people living in poverty crossing the border every day at 2, 3 a.m. just to catch the buses that would take farm workers to the fields to collect, paychecks in places that exploited them for labor. And I kind of vividly remember a lot of this imagery because it really just serves like as a huge dichotomy of like what people's perception of the border is in America versus the perception of the border to people that live at the border, right? Like, I think Calexico embodies like the defiance of borders or like physical borders that people obsess about so much today in our administration. The identity of the town was very much built on people going back and forth every day. Children from Mexicali would go to school in Calexico. Families who might not have like parents with both, citizenship status could have, meetings like across these like barriers and still, be able to contact and see each other on a daily basis. And to me, growing up in a border was never like something I thought about much until later on when I went to college and I met people from other parts of the country. Kind of to reiterate, right? Like this is a 99.9% Mexican city. Everyone spoke Spanish. I would speak Spanish outside of the classroom. Everyone would. But thankfully, I was able to like continue on with my studies, gratefully because of my parents, which led to me getting a full-ride scholarship to UC Berkeley through the Gates Millennium Scholars. And it was here that I kind of started being completely intimidated by science. Berkeley is a very competitive place. And one of the programs that I think helped ease my transition into STEM and in college life in general was the summer bridge program, which takes students from low-income high schools who might not even have had physics teacher or chemistry teachers, which I didn't have. Like, we took chemistry and it was just like the substitute teacher, like putting on movies like every day. So going on to Berkeley, they were like, okay, we need to help these students. We need to teach them the summer before they go to college how to do calculus in an environment where other students who look like them can learn it at the same rate, right? Instead of just dropping them into the freshman course and then bam, you're in a 300-person classroom and you don't even know what to do and you're drowning by the insane talent of the people around you who might have had more resources growing up. Another big highlight of my early time in college, and I think all 4 years, is the fact that I joined a fraternity. And I kind of joke about this a lot, but to be completely honest, this is extremely transformative. Like, I joined a fraternity my freshman year, and I immediately noticed, like, okay, like, I think the hook is awesome. The fact that we were people from all walks of life, that was our purpose, just to get, you know, Black, Indigenous, Asian, white, and you name it, like, living under the same roof for the purpose of fostering a brotherhood. And I think it really helped, you know, foster a lot of, like, really honest conversations about race and ethnicity in the United States. And my best friends in the fraternity were people who were majors in, like, ethnic studies, Latin American studies, and through them, I kind of learned, like, a lot of U.S. history that was not taught growing up. And you would think that someone growing up in a border town would know a little more, or would be taught a little more about the relationship between Mexico and the United States. So I'm going to take a little detour here to highlight some of that history. I think the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico centers completely around labor. We're seen as seen in this political cartoon here, we're basically seen as both as a source of cheap labor, but also as a source to rile up a conservative base that thrive on xenophobia to get out the boat. And I think this is nothing new. Like, Trump did not start this. This is a thing that the U.S. has actively sanctioned federal laws for the discrimination of Mexican immigrants. And one of those biggest events was Mexican repatriation, in which Mexican immigrants, or people who look like Mexican immigrants, were deported en masse. And a lot of them were citizens of the United States. Like, it wasn't just like taking up people and like, okay, like, maybe you don't have your papers. Like, no, you look Mexican, let's get you out. Because there was a lot of fear from white farm workers that the Great Depression was going to create less jobs. And so we need to get rid of that competition in California, Texas, and Arizona. And I think sort of like the weird relationship is like, I feel like the U.S. doesn't know what to do with us, because then you have the Bracero program, where, or literally called the labor movement program, in which they were like, okay, just kidding, World War II is about to start, we need your labor. But at the same time, you had things like Operation Wetback in Texas, that's the real name, you know, putting immigrants in cages based solely on how they look. Like I said, it wasn't just people that were here without their papers or were undocumented. Thankfully, I think a lot of us benefited from the love and labor of, like, Black American men and women through the civil rights movement. And one of the direct contributions to the immigration movement was sort of like the Civil Rights Voting Act happened in 1964. And then all that momentum sort of convinced Lyndon Johnson that, like, okay, I can be a little more, like, progressive. Let's me pass the Immigration Nationality Act, which removes some of the barriers into legal immigration to the United States. But, you know, sadly, now a lot has changed. You know, the civil rights movement was awesome. And I think people are starting to wake up to the idea that we still have a lot of the same problems going on to this day. Like, these were people's parents, these were people's grandparents. Like, there hasn't been that much to separate us from that time period. So a lot of feelings of racism is still alive today, and xenophobia. For example, like, seeing how across the aisle, deportations is just such a good, like, political way to get people to vote. And you would think that Trump is probably the worst offender, but he's not. He just happens to be the most recent one. But however, one of the things that he's really, really sort of pushed for is the idea of really supporting financially ICE through their raids, in which they capture people who are not even the people who are on the warrant, but rather what's known as collaterals. You, like, we're going to get all 10 of you, even though the warrant was just for one, because the federal government is giving us permission to detain you in migrant detention camps, which are literally cages, and just to stifle things such as the migrant farm worker labor movement, but most importantly, like, also reflected by things locally, such as the Arizona SB 1070 law, in which, like, I don't know if you guys remember, but this was like, okay, like people were discriminated based on their color of the skin. Like you could be stopped on the street and ask for your passport or ask for your papers, and the police just had to answer to no one. Like they just could. And I think all of this, why I went on this tangent, it's not to sort of like just pontificate and like get on my soapbox, but to really illustrate the point that for minoritized students in STEM, imposter syndrome, which has been talked about a lot in this lecture series, can originate not just from a feelings of inadequacy when it comes to our science or ability to do science, but also from the fact that we are in spaces that historically were not made for us. And I think that's something that I am reminded about each time my mom like rants about some racist asshole at the Walmart asking her to speak English correctly. And I think that, okay, tying it back to STEM, like what can you do as a faculty? What can you do as a postdoc? I highly recommend, I mean, I think this is like one of the great things about DASL is that it really is normalizing our presence in the sciences. And one of the ways that I found is most effective is through our direct inclusion in research, right? And so kind of like Nicole was mentioning, like someone really did take a chance on students like her and me. In this case, it was Ludovica Labruna, who worked in Richard Ivory's Cognition and Action Lab. I sent an email out like when I was a sophomore because one of my brothers was a education psychology researcher, and he was like, hey, you can get credits for doing research. And I was like, okay, that seems like an easy way to get credits. But through my interview with Ludovica, like I think we kind of connected really quickly because she's an immigrant from Italy. And she also kind of struggled like learning the language and sort of navigating academic spaces that where she just had no idea about. So she saw that potential in me, not just as a researcher and as a student, but also as like a way to like, okay, like let me directly address and make spaces for students like Christian to thrive in science. And so I recommend a lot of faculty here, like if someone emails you asking for research, like your intuition shouldn't be like, let me see your CV, let me see your resume. It's like, okay, tell me more about yourself. Are you someone that I need to take a chance on for the benefit of not just your career, but STEM as a whole? And it's kind of crazy how it works, right? Because once you're given that first opportunity, once someone takes a chance on you, the doors swing wide open. I was lucky enough that throughout my years in research, Richard Ivory really supported my inclusion in the Biology Scholars Program, the Maximizing Access to Research Careers Program, the UCSF Summer Research Training Program, all these things that he and Ludovica really just pushed me to do because I had no idea what these things were. I presented my first research posters, and most importantly, these programs created structure of students who looked like me or shared similar, first generation low income backgrounds to become friends and sort of like have, like I said earlier, honest conversations about our inclusion in these spaces. However, imposter syndrome is a hell of a thing. Like I didn't think I was ready for grad school, even though I had like 2 years of research and 2 letters of recommendations from professors. I was like, nah, like I don't want to give anyone the doubt that I am capable of going to grad school. So me and my girlfriend at the time, and now my fiance, Maribel Patino, we applied to the Penn Prep Postbaccalaureate Research Education Program, which I highly recommend if you're faculty looking up today. Arnaldo Diaz runs this program through the biomedical department, and it, in my opinion, serves like as a model that a lot of universities should aspire to if they really, really care about creating institutional structure to prepare underrepresented students for grad school. Not only we learned how to do research, and they obviously like paid for me to do research full time, and I learned really what research was instead of just doing it part-time in undergrad, but they also kind of pushed us to be like, okay, we're not, like I know people can procrastinate if they're not pushed to do it, so let's have a workshop in which we all apply to the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship and sort of peer edit each other's essays. And it's a model that I've taken to this day in our program. And now Emily Baltz from the Neuroscience Graduate Program runs this workshop this year. But essentially what happened is that this institutional structure meant for people like us, allowed people like me to get funded and go on to grad school. Because people were like, okay, like we want these people to not just be included, not just be recruited, but be retained in science. Let's make these people thrive. And so what happened is that one of the things I would also like to highlight is that if you're really interested in diversifying your graduate program, then you need to make that interest very explicitly clear to the students. I think one of the reasons I joined the Neuroscience Graduate Program is because I met them at the SACNAS and Abercans conference, which are science conferences for minority undergrads. And they were very much like, wow, UCSD and GP brought over like 8 people. And I look at other tables and there's like no representatives there. There's like maybe 1 student and like 1 faculty, but UCSD came like en masse. And that to me signaled through their conversations with the students that this was going to be a safe environment for me to do my science in, but also support any sort of structural or changes to sort of address inequity in STEM. And one of the awesome things as well is that I ended up joining Dr. Christina Gremel's lab. And one of the reasons why I joined her lab is that I felt that she was very much explicitly interested in diversifying STEM. I am very grateful for her support, both scientifically, but also like personally when it comes to like some of the diversity initiatives that I've been part of. And she really does serve like as a role model for how to help students from these low-income first-generation backgrounds thrive in science. So speaking of science, we're going to take this like wide left turn to like, let me talk about my research. So I'm interested in decision making, particularly because it's such an integral part of daily life. You need to be adaptive. You always need to be meeting the current demands of whatever your environment requires for you to survive and, you know, pass on your offspring. However, alcohol dependence can really mess up decision-making function. And I think that is something that is very evident, you know, when you consider people suffering from alcohol use disorder, where they consume alcohol at alarming rates despite negative consequences to both their mental and physical health. It promotes this like vicious cycle of intoxication, binging, withdrawal, and craving that leads to a lot of negative outcomes, as you might assume. In this case, death just keeps increasing from alcohol abuse over the last couple of years. And I'm pretty sure with COVID, you know, there's articles out now where like alcohol abuse is rampant during quarantine. And I think as a source of personal motivation, I was also like, hey, like in my culture, alcoholism is like super prevalent. Like it's almost a joke. Like you give like 3-year-olds beer because it's just funny. Like, and to me, like I didn't realize how messed up that was until I started talking to people from other cultures, and they were like, that's not okay. And I was like, oh, you're right. Like, why is Mexican culture like so like numb to the negative effects of alcoholism? So I kind of like I saw like Dr. Gremel's lab as an opportunity to like tackle not just really cool science, but something that comes as a personal, you know, motivation to me, because my family has suffered from alcoholism as well. And so what sort of dysfunction does alcohol dependence do to decision making? And what I focus on is goal-directed decision making. That is, actions under goal-directed control are performed with regards to their consequences. For example, let's say you have someone shooting a basket, and that basket is associated with a valued outcome. In this case, you know, scoring a point. So goal-directed actions are those that are sensitive to changes in the value of the consequences associated with that action. And not just that, but the relationship between the action and those consequences. So if I was performing shooting a basket under goal-directed control, and if the ref suddenly said, okay, if you make the basket, you get no points, then I would correspondingly not be interested or like want to shoot the basket anymore because I get nothing out of it. However, a habitual person might perseverate with that a lot more and be insensitive to those changes in outcome value. And this area of the brain that I study is called the orbitofrontal cortex. It is represented across species, and it is particularly vulnerable to alcohol abuse, both structurally and functionally. And without getting too much into detail, I just kind of want to highlight the overall problem that I'm interested in researching. It's like, what microcircuits within the orbitofrontal cortex control this goal-directed decision-making that I mentioned, and what does alcohol do to those microcircuits? And my overarching hypothesis for the first, you know, years in lab was that alcohol dependence alters how goal-directed action is represented in the orbitofrontal cortex, which might give rise to the strengthening of habitual control, that is, an insensitivity to outcome value changes. So I use this task that is very innovative in my opinion, because not just because I do it, but because it's, in the context of the literature, a lot of decision making is done in a very like limited context. For example, like here's a cue, the animal associates that cue with something they need to do, you know, maybe the animal's head fixed. But I think that our lab is really trying to tackle more naturalistic decision making, like the animal is freely moving, or like there's nothing signaling that they need to do something. Because I think in daily life, right, we just make decisions without without waiting to be told what to do. And so in this task, I train a mouse to hold down a lever past a certain duration criteria, and only when they exceed this criteria do they get a pellet. And only does the pellet get delivered until they let go of the lever. So they're using this history of what happens between their actions and the outcome to guide future decision making. And what's really cool is that because we don't reward them until they let go of the lever, is that we can really capture this window, this uninterrupted window, where they're making continuous decision-making actions. And it can therefore allow us to probe what microcircuits support these processes. And I really, once again, want to highlight, this is completely self-paced. There's nothing telling the mouse to press the lever. There's nothing even telling it what the criteria is. They find this on their own as they accumulate experience and use that experience to guide future decision-making. So the way we model alcohol dependence is through the chronic intermittent ethanol procedure, which has been highly validated across species, in the sense that it induces alcohol withdrawal syndrome, which is a key criterion in the diagnosis of alcohol dependence. So this is a mouse model in which we put mice in vapor chambers. So there's mice that get exposed 16 hours a day for 4 days a week for 4 weeks, and they do get intoxicated. It's actually kind of cute how they get drunk. But then in contrast, you have mice that, just weren't exposed to alcohol at all. And so we trained them how to do the lever pressing task, in which, once again, as the session goes on, they're sort of learning like, maybe I should be holding the lever down longer to get that nice pellet reward. And the way I interrogate activity occurring during this decision-making actions is by using in vivo extracellular electrophysiology. I literally stick electrodes into the brain of a live mouse performing the task. And some of the things we found is that mice perform this task to similar levels than those who were not exposed to alcohol at all. So this is kind of like, to us, or some people might be very intuitive, right? Because people are like, oh, like treatment should have a direct, effect on like behavior. But in the context of literature, it makes sense because alcoholics can still learn things. Instrumental learning is not impeded, even with orbitofrontal cortex like damage. But nonetheless, what we saw is that the animals were performing this task under goal-directed control, and that those that were exposed to alcohol were not. They were insensitive to changes in the outcome value in the task, and were therefore more reflective of habitual control of the lever pressing. So we have a task where alcoholic mice can learn, as well as alcohol-naive mice, but they're doing it differently. And we're going to probe why that is. And the way we do that, we look at spiking activity as the animals hold down the lever across a variety of neurons. And sort of to go really quickly through this, we found differences not just as animals were preparing to make that decision, but also as they were evaluating the outcome of their actions, which we believe does have influenced the behavioral control of their lever pressing behavior. And I'm sorry I can't go too much into detail, but if you really want to know, I have a bioarchive up on the internet that you guys can look at. So for the remainder of my thesis, I'm really going to interrogate like what specific circuit mechanisms led to this dependence-induced change in orbitofrontal cortex activity. And one of the ways I'm going to look at this is structurally. I'm going to use retrograde viral tracing techniques to see how alcohol dependence changes the information or the sources of information going into the orbitofrontal cortex. And then functionally, by looking at how activity from different genetically identified subpopulations in the orbitofrontal cortex encode this ongoing decision-making activity. And so, not only do I get to do all of this under Tina's mentorship, but she has been a really amazing source of support when it comes to my own sort of initiatives. And sorry, not my own, because so 4 years ago, a couple grad students from the neuroscience grad program and from the cognitive science program got together and we're like, yeah, we all kind of benefited from a lot of these diversity initiatives. Like we have to give back. Like we can't just like benefit and like not elevate other students. And that's kind of what we did. Like this is literally like a grassroots things. Like I Googled like how to start a UC organization, how to get access to funding. And thankfully the neuroscience graduate program has been really gracious in their support as well. And over the last 4 years, we've gotten to mentor a variety of different underrepresented students through information panels on how to apply to grad school, how to do a statement of purpose, how to take a gap year, and so on. And what's sort of really keeping this fire going is, seeing students that are incoming into our program now, like current first years, that have gone to our events, to our Colors of the Brains events in the past. So it's really amazing that we get to see this like journey from like undergrads to like grad school from the students that have been part of our organization. And sort of to highlight how proactive we are about this today, Tina and Ege are going to talk about applying to grad school. And there's like a Zoom link if you're interested in that, or if you want to disseminate to your undergrads, but that's happening today at 6 p.m. And so sort of finish off, right? Like some sort of parting words is, what can you do as a graduate student? I think that it's almost like a disservice not to use your platform, because you do have a platform. You apply to grad school, you know how to write a statement of purpose. Like there's so many students that don't even know how to start, right? Use that platform to help students, and you can help them locally through the Sacramento chapter at UC San Diego, or the PASS program, or through Colors of the Brain, but also nationally through Científico Latino, Disabled in STEM, and many other organizations. But as a postdoc, not only can you mentor undergraduates and graduate students, but you can also use your credentials as a doctorate to go to these conferences that are aimed at increasing representation of minorities in science by being a judge for like the different posters in a safe environment, right? You can give them feedback without making them feel like crap. Or like making them feel like they're inadequate because they, you share like similar views on diversity in science. You can review travel award abstracts. You can go to the one-on-one mentoring workshops. And then finally, as a faculty, I really think people should be proactive about finding opportunities for their students. Like don't wait until the grad student or the postdoc is like, hey, I'm applying to this. Because a lot of times for underrepresented students, we are not our best advocates. You really have to go out of your way and mentor these students in a unique and special way. And finally, if you're, sorry, I'm almost done. And if you're sort of like program administrator, I think that bringing back like a lot of the grants that have helped undergraduate, postbaccalaureate, and graduate students get into research, it would be nice to get, Mark here at UCSD again. And so thanks to everyone. What does it take to get an immigrant to neuroscience? A hell of a lot of work, a hell of a lot of patience from people who, I don't know, like I deeply admire. And of course you for taking the time to like listen to someone, listen to a different perspective and educating yourself. Thank you so much for listening.